In city after city across West Africa, the scene is the same. French flags torn down, set ablaze, and trampled underfoot. Crowds chant in the streets, France dégage, France get out. The speeches aren't polite, they're pointed. Presidents step up to microphones and call France what they believe it is. A foreign manipulator, a thief in a tailored suit, still pulling strings from 1,000 miles away. Because in Africa, France isn't remembered as a former colonizer, it's seen as the colonizer that never really left. Across the continent, from the Sahel to the Gulf of Guinea, France carved out one of the largest colonial empires in human history. But what made its legacy so uniquely bitter was the afterlife of its conquest, the way France hung on after independence like a shadow that never fades. And that shadow? It dictated currencies, installed presidents, backed dictators, controlled oil fields, telecommunication networks, military bases, and elections. All while pretending it was no longer in charge. So, when people say France is Africa's most hated former colonizer, they're not reaching. They're describing a relationship built on decades of exploitation, manipulation, and betrayal. A relationship dressed in diplomacy, but soaked in control. The system France built after colonization is so resilient, so calculated, that even today, many African countries are still fighting to fully escape it. This is Untangling Africa, and in this episode, we're discussing why France, more than Britain, Belgium, Portugal, or Spain, is at the center of Africa's modern-day fury. It started with a map. Lines drawn by men in rooms far from the deserts of the Sahel or the forests of the Congo. In Berlin, 1884, Europe's great powers sat around a table and casually divided Africa. France came away with a lion's share. From Senegal to Madagascar, from Algeria to Chad, France engulfed Africa. By the early 20th century, the French Empire controlled more African land than almost any other power on Earth. Tens of millions of people were absorbed into a system that promised civilization, all while delivering domination. Unlike Britain's more hands-off, indirect rule, the French believed in assimilation, the idea that their colonies could and should become French. On paper, it sounded like equality, but in reality, it was a machine built to erase local cultures and replace them with French language, customs, and loyalty to the tricolour flag. The French implemented the Code de l'Indigène, a brutal legal system that stripped Africans of citizenship and gave colonial administrators almost unlimited power. Under this code, indigenous Africans could be imprisoned without trial, forced into unpaid labour, and fined for laziness, disrespect, or failing to show proper deference to French officials. In short, it turned entire populations into subjects, only a little better than slaves. And nowhere did that ambition and that violence go further than in Algeria. Because Algeria wasn't treated like a colony, it was treated like a mirror, a reflection France tried to polish until it saw itself looking back. In 1830, France invaded Algeria, and within a few decades, it had seized the coastline, driven people from their land, and begun settling it with Europeans. By the early 1900s, over 1 million French settlers, known as Pieds Noirs, lived in Algeria. They owned the farms, they ran the towns, and they voted in elections for a parliament back in Paris. Meanwhile, the indigenous Algerians, 9 million of them, were treated like foreigners in their own homeland. They had no rights under French law, and they couldn't vote unless they gave up their Muslim identity. They lived under the Code de l'Indigène, which, by the way, remained in place until 1945. For over a century, France insisted Algeria wasn't a colony at all. It was part of France, just like Normandy or Marseille. But this lie only made the truth harder to hide when the resistance began. In 1954, the Algerian War of Independence erupted. It wasn't a protest movement, it was a full-blown insurgency, assassinations, bombings, ambushes, and France responded with brutal counterinsurgency tactics, torture, executions, collective punishment, and internment camps. Entire villages were cleared, civilians were disappeared. French paratroopers dropped into the Kasbah of Algiers to crush the National Liberation Front, and they did it with no regard for civilian life. And this wasn't happening in secret. France's own intellectuals, like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, denounced the war. The press published exposés on torture, but the government pressed on. Over 300,000 Algerians died in the war, many of them civilians. This wasn't the end of colonialism. This was its most desperate, violent phase. In 1962, after 8 years of war, Algeria finally won independence. But the scars didn't fade. France refused to apologize. Many of the documents related to the war remained classified for decades, and the trauma echoed in Algerian politics and French society, in every family that lost someone to the fighting or the repression. Algeria wasn't the only place where France showed how far it was willing to go to keep control. 13 years after the Algerian War even began, a rebellion broke out in the Indian Ocean on the massive island of Madagascar, one of France's oldest and most isolated colonies. The year was 1947 and the world was still recovering from World War II. But while France was celebrating liberation from German occupation, it was still holding millions under colonial rule. In Madagascar, people had had enough. A movement called the MDRM, a political party pushing for independence through legal means, gained massive support. But when that path was blocked, the frustration exploded. In March 1947, uprisings began across the island. Attacks on military posts, destruction of infrastructure, a full-blown revolt against the colonial regime. France responded the same way it had always responded, with overwhelming force. Troops were rushed in, entire regions were placed under emergency rule, villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned to the ground, civilians tortured, executed, or disappeared, and the death toll was at least 30,000, with some estimates putting it as high as 100,000. And just like in Algeria, the denial came next. France buried the massacre in bureaucracy and silence. The MDRM was banned, its leaders were imprisoned, and the uprising was erased from French textbooks for decades, treated as a footnote if it was mentioned at all. But in Madagascar, the memory never faded. But France's largest holding came in West Africa. From Senegal to Mali, Côte d'Ivoire to Niger, France ruled over a massive block of territories grouped into a single administrative structure, Afrique Occidentale Française, or AOF. It was presented as a unified federation, a model of rational governance, but in reality, it was a patchwork of extraction zones held together by force, bureaucracy, and carefully engineered division. Here, France perfected the art of rule without recognition, managing millions of Africans as if they were one large workforce, a source of labor and raw material. Throughout French West Africa, local populations were subjected to forced labor systems. Men were routinely rounded up and sent to build railroads, roads, and ports, the very infrastructure that made it easier to export African resources to France. Villages were required to supply a certain number of laborers. Refusal could mean punishment, and resistance meant repression. One of the most infamous examples is the Congo Ocean Railway just outside the AOF borders. Over 17,000 Africans died building it, many from exhaustion, disease, or abuse. And while the French called it development, the benefits never stayed. The goods moved outward while poverty stayed behind. On top of violence, the French also used ethnic fragmentation as a tool of governance. Local chiefs were appointed by French administrators, often from rival groups, ensuring that no single ethnic or political bloc could grow too powerful. Loyalty was rewarded with positions, exemptions, and French favors. Rebellion was crushed early or co-opted. In schools, children were taught in French, about France, about the world through France's point of view. Their own histories were either erased or rewritten to center on the civilizing mission. Generations were raised to see their future in Paris, not in Timbuktu, Dakar, or Algiers. What made this so effective was the distance, the illusion of neutrality. Policies were written in ministries in Paris. Officials rotated in and out of posts. By the time violence or oppression reached the newspapers, it was already buried in paperwork or denied outright. No one in metropolitan France saw the scars, the destroyed villages, the empty homes, the children taken from their families and placed in colonial boarding schools where they were punished for speaking their mother tongue. These were never front-page news in Paris. To many in France, the empire was a noble mission. To many in Africa, it was a machine that extracted labor, suppressed dissent, and killed anyone who got in their way, all while insisting it was for their own good. And when independence movements began to grow, France didn't loosen its grip, it just changed the rules, not the game. By the 1960s, France's African empire had supposedly crumbled. The French flags came down, national anthems were composed, and on the world stage, France presented itself as a benevolent former ruler, handing over the keys to newly independent nations. But in reality, France never left. It simply changed its methods. Gone were the colonial governors. In their place came special advisors. Gone were the battalions. In their place, defense agreements. And gone was formal rule, replaced by something far more enduring: Françafrique. After a brutal war for independence in Algeria, Charles de Gaulle realized France couldn't keep the empire by force. So he offered independence, but made sure the invisible levers of power stayed in French hands. France would let Africa stand, but only if it stood where Paris pointed. Nowhere was this clearer than in Côte d'Ivoire. Its first president, Félix Houphouët-Boigny, wasn't just an ally, he was the blueprint. A former French cabinet minister, deeply connected to the Gaullist elites, Houphouët-Boigny ruled Côte d'Ivoire for 33 years with France's full backing. He famously called France our second country. Behind the scenes, he let French companies dominate the economy. He gave France stability, and France gave him power. And this became the template. France would back loyal rulers, and in return, those rulers would keep the doors open to French banks, French businesses, and, when necessary, French soldiers. But not everyone bowed. In 1958, as de Gaulle toured the continent offering a new French community, only one country said no: Guinea. Its leader, Sékou Touré, didn't mince words. We prefer freedom in poverty to riches in slavery. The vote was overwhelming. Guinea rejected France's offer and chose full sovereignty. Paris was furious. Within days, France cut all aid, pulled every advisor, shut off electricity, stripped buildings of equipment, and even sabotaged infrastructure. Phones were ripped from the walls, blueprints were destroyed. In some cases, toilets were uninstalled and light bulbs taken from ceilings. Hospitals were left without medicine and engineers left projects half finished. It wasn't just spite, it was a warning. Touré later claimed French agents stayed behind to incite unrest and discredit the new government. Whether or not that's provable, the message was clear: leave the French system and you'll be made to suffer. Guinea survived, but it was isolated, and the lesson wasn't lost on the rest of Africa. If Guinea was punished for saying no, Gabon was rewarded for saying yes. By the 1970s, Gabon was small, rich in oil, and tightly wrapped in the Françafrique web. France didn't hide its interests there. It embedded itself in the machinery of the state. The French oil giants, Elf Aquitaine, backed by the French government, operated as more than a company. It was a second government. It financed campaigns, paid off officials, and funneled millions through offshore accounts. In one corruption trial, a former ELF executive put it bluntly: "In Gabon, we were the state." Presidents like Omar Bongo became fixtures of this system. Bongo ruled for over 4 decades, enriching his family while securing France's access to Gabon's oil. He famously quipped, "Gabon without France is like a car without an engine. France without Gabon is like a car without fuel." If a leader cooperated, France helped him. If he didn't, France had other tools. That part, the assassinations, the coups, the regimes that rose and fell at Paris's convenience, is where we're going next. France claimed to support democracy in Africa, but behind the speeches and summits, it built a different kind of system, one that depended on obedience rather than self-determination. When a loyal partner ruled, Paris sent aid, advisors, and praise, but when a leader questioned French interests, there was often a sudden shift in power, and it rarely looked like a coincidence. It started early, in one of France's smallest former colonies, Togo. In 1963, Togo's first president, Sylvanus Olympio, was found shot outside the US Embassy. He had refused to absorb hundreds of ex-French colonial soldiers into his national army. Many of them blamed him for cutting off their careers and pensions. One of them, a young officer named Ationg Eyadema, would later take power and hold it for nearly 4 decades. Olympio also had another ambition. He wanted Togo to issue its own currency, break from the French-backed CFA franc, and take control of the economy. He didn't get the chance. The new regime quickly aligned with Paris. The French connection was never formally acknowledged, but it didn't have to be. Eyadema had trained in the French military. He kept close ties with French generals. He stabilized the country, and in return, France looked the other way. What happened in Togo became a quiet template. There was no need for occupation, no need for headlines, just the removal of one man and the elevation of another, and the return of business as usual. By the early 1980s, most African presidents were playing the game, shaking hands in Paris, signing deals, maintaining the illusion of independence. But then came Thomas Sankara. At just 33 years old, this young army captain took power in Upper Volta through a modest coup. A year later, he renamed the country Burkina Faso, the land of upright men. But the name was just the beginning. He slashed government salaries, including his own. He banned limousines, foreign bank accounts, even air conditioning in official buildings. He refused IMF loans, expelled French military advisors, and gave blistering speeches calling out not just Western powers, but Africa's own elites. He launched a mass vaccination drive that reached millions. He pushed land reform, reforestation, and women's rights, criminalizing forced marriages and female genital mutilation. He appointed women to high office and told men to do their share of domestic work. In just 4 years, his government made real, visible changes. And while he wasn't perfect, his policies made Paris sweat. His people adored him, and France? Well, France was watching carefully. Sankara had formed ties with Cuba, Libya, and the Soviet bloc. He was too bold, too independent, too influential, and maybe even too communist. And he was saying things out loud that other leaders only whispered. Then, in October 1987, Sankara was dead, shot during a coup led by his closest friend and second-in-command, Blaise Compaoré. The new regime immediately reopened ties with France. Military cooperation resumed, contracts returned, and many of Sankara's reforms were quietly rolled back. Officially, France denies any role in the coup, but the suspicions have never gone away. For years, France refused to release its intelligence archives. It wasn't until 2021, under mounting pressure, that President Macron agreed to declassify some documents. But by then, trust was already broken. French agents were reportedly on the ground in Ouagadougou the day after the assassination, allegedly to erase wiretap evidence of the plotters. Whether that happened or not, the result was clear. Sankara was gone and France had its ally back in power. Blaise Compaoré ruled for 27 years. And for many across Africa, the death of Sankara marked the end of a dream, the idea that a leader could rise up, challenge the system, and survive it. To this day, protesters in Burkina Faso carry his portrait through the streets. They point to it as proof that independence was never real, that any attempt to break the chain would be answered with silence, then gunfire. After Sankara's assassination, the message didn't need to be spoken. Everyone already understood it. Challenge France and you won't last long. But protecting allies was just as much a part of the system. In 1964, Gabon's president, Léon Mba, was overthrown in a coup by junior officers. The next morning, French paratroopers landed in Libreville. They reinstalled Mba, rounded up the plotters, and put things back the way Paris preferred them. That operation backed up the French unspoken guarantee: if you're loyal, France will step in to ensure you stay in power. Mba's successor, Omar Bongo, took the lesson to heart. For the next 4 decades, he ruled Gabon with steady French backing. Oil contracts, campaign financing, diplomatic cover, whatever was needed to keep the arrangement stable. At home, elections were rigged and dissent was tightly managed. Abroad, Bongo kept things smooth with Paris. Gabon wasn't alone. In Togo, France supported Gnassingbé Eyadema, the man who rose to power after the country's first president was gunned down. He held the presidency for 38 years, outlasting 5 French presidents. In Cameroon, Paul Biya has ruled since 1982. Every election he's won has faced accusations of fraud, suppression, and violence. France never walked away, investment stayed, so did the arms deals. And if anyone tried to break that structure, they weren't just facing their own army, they were facing a foreign power with troops on the ground, embassies nearby, and no interest in change. By the early 2000s, France's presence in Africa was no longer hidden behind coups or contracts. In Côte d'Ivoire, it was tanks on the streets. The country was split by civil war. Rebels held the north. The government clung to the south. France had deployed thousands of troops, officially as peacekeepers, but many Ivorians believed Paris had taken sides. Tensions exploded on November 6, 2004. That morning, Ivorian aircraft bombed a French military base in Bouaké. 9 French soldiers were killed. The government claimed it was an accident, but Paris didn't wait for clarification. Within hours, French forces destroyed the entire Ivorian Air Force. Helicopters, jets, gone. Then, they took control of Abidjan's international airport. What followed was chaos. Crowds filled the streets, furious at what they saw as a foreign invasion. State media called it an attack on national sovereignty. Thousands of Ivorian youth stormed the French embassy, targeted French-owned businesses, and clashed with troops. And then, French soldiers opened fire. The Red Cross reported over 150 wounded, many hit by live rounds. Ivorian officials claimed more than 30 people were killed. Some died near checkpoints, others were shot outside hotels and embassies. Footage showed blood on the pavement, smoke rising from looted shops, and armored vehicles rolling through neighborhoods. To many Ivorians, this was colonial repression all over again, only now with cameras rolling. France said it acted in self-defense. Its foreign minister insisted there was no hidden agenda. But in Abidjan, the damage was already done. The relationship was shattered and trust never returned. In the years that followed, Côte d'Ivoire shifted its alliances. Protests flared every time France tried to assert influence, and by 2011, when another political crisis erupted, Ivorian nationalists, on top of opposing the government, were raging against what they called the return of the colonizer. But control, over time, comes at a cost. Every rigged election, every silenced journalist, every protest gunned down in the street, it built the case against France in the minds of millions of Africans. They began asking, if we have our own countries, why does it still feel like someone else is pulling the strings? The answer was the dictators propped up the systems left behind and the financial instruments France had set up. It was all there, buried deep in contracts that the everyday African would not have access to reading, much less understanding. Because long after the soldiers left, the money stayed. Some control is exercised through soldiers and strongmen, but the most enduring kind, the kind that outlives regimes, is written in ink. Trade deals, loan terms, currency systems, contracts that look like cooperation but act like shackles. In post-colonial Africa, France backed itself, legally, financially, and systematically. They embedded themselves into the foundations of these new nations. The flag came down, and the troops pulled back, but the money stayed French. And nowhere is that legacy clearer or more controversial than in the CFA franc. The CFA franc was born in 1945, in the dying days of World War II, when France was broke, battered, and determined to hold onto its empire. The name stood for Colonie Française d'Afrique, and the purpose was simple: tie African economies to Paris, guarantee cheap raw materials, and stabilize French global influence through financial control. And when independence came, they changed the name but not the system. Today, 14 African countries still use versions of the CFA franc. The notes may feature local symbols, but the design is unmistakably French. The currency is printed in France, pegged to the euro, and for decades, each country was required to park half their foreign reserves in the French treasury. In return, France promised convertibility, stability, and access to international markets. But for critics, it was colonialism in a suit. These countries couldn't set their own interest rates. They couldn't print money in response to crises. They couldn't devalue their currency during recessions. Every major decision had to go through a board where French officials held veto power. Economist Ndongo Samba Sila called it the last colonial currency still in use. African economists, opposition leaders, even former heads of state have condemned the CFA franc as a tool of economic subjugation. Because while the system kept inflation low, it also choked industrial growth, blocked emergency spending, and made it nearly impossible for countries to pursue independent economic strategies. And then there's the symbolism. The fact that decades after independence, a country's monetary future was still being signed off in Paris. The currency was legal and the treaties were real, but to many in Africa, this was a leash. This felt like the French colonizers never left. But the CFA franc wasn't the only chain. While the currency locked down monetary policy, French corporations moved in on the real prize: Africa's infrastructure, oil, ports, and power grids. Take Total Energies, formerly Total, which absorbed Elf Aquitaine. In country after country, Gabon, Cameroon, Congo, Total secured massive oil concessions, often under deals brokered in French presidential palaces. In some places, they paid less in royalties than companies in the Middle East, yet walked away with billions in profit. Then there was Bolloré Africa Logistics. For years, this one company controlled more than a dozen major African ports. They ran the container terminals, managed the rail lines, dominated trucking routes. If goods came in and out of West or Central Africa, chances are Bolloré got paid. They didn't win these contracts in open competition, they won them because French-backed regimes made sure they did. And behind Bolloré, loans from French banks, financing from the French Development Agency, quiet phone calls from Paris. In telecoms, the pattern repeated. Orange, formerly France Telecom, became one of the biggest mobile providers in Francophone Africa. It offered coverage, yes, but also data control, surveillance capacity, and market dominance in places where competition barely existed. These looked like a continuation of the old colonial policy of exploitation and corruption disguised as modern enterprises. The result was that in many African countries, the biggest companies weren't African, they were French. the ports, the fuel, the networks, all flowing through corporate giants headquartered in Paris. And while shareholders raked in the profits, African entrepreneurs were often left shut out, unable to compete with billion-euro conglomerates that came with their own embassies, militaries, and presidents on speed dial. And if oil was the blood of France's empire in Africa, uranium was the spine. And for decades, that uranium came from Niger, one of the world's top producers and one of the poorest countries on Earth. Since the 1970s, French nuclear giant Areva, now renamed Orano, has mined the sands of northern Niger, extracting the radioactive ore that powers France's energy grid. Around 70% of France's electricity comes from nuclear energy. Without Niger, the lights in Paris might go out. But while Areva grew into a multi-billion euro powerhouse, Niger stayed broke. For years, the company paid out a royalty rate of just 5.5%, one of the lowest in the global uranium industry. There were no export taxes, and many of the contracts were sealed behind closed doors, never released to the public. In 2013, Niger's own president, Mahamadou Issoufou, said bluntly, "This is a throwback to the post-colonial era when France dominated our economy." His government tried to renegotiate. He wanted the royalty raised to at least 12%, a modest rate by global standards. But even that turned out to be not as straightforward as they hoped, with veiled threats of withdrawal and pressure from Paris. Meanwhile, Niger's people lived with the consequences. In mining towns like Arlit, workers suffered radiation exposure, groundwater contamination spread, and locals reported higher rates of illness. And yet, the wealth never stayed. Schools, hospital, and infrastructure was still missing. In 2013, Areva made over 9 billion euros in revenue. That same year, Niger's entire GDP was under 7 billion euros. The math made the politics simple. Niger was fueling France and staying in the dark. And that became the symbol of how Françafrique worked. It was a system built to keep the imbalance permanent. For decades, France's grip on African economies went largely unchallenged, masked behind technocratic language, legal treaties, and diplomatic smiles. But a new generation wasn't buying it. In cities from Dakar to Ouagadougou, young activists began asking the question their parents had been too afraid or too exhausted to ask. Why is our money printed in France? Why are our ports run by French billionaires? Why are we still poor in countries rich with gold, oil, and uranium? And the answers, or the lack of them, sparked something bigger. Protests broke out. In Mali, crowds surrounded French military bases, demanding a full withdrawal. In Niger, activists called out France for plundering uranium while children went to school in buildings with no electricity. And all across Francophone Africa, a single word kept echoing through the chants: dégage, get out. There was a sense that the game had been rigged since the start, and that every promise of partnership was just a new version of the same deal. Even leaders started shifting their tone. Some expelled French troops, others cancelled long-standing agreements. A few even reopened talks about ditching the CFA franc entirely. This resentment was built brick by brick over decades, in contracts, in currencies, in deals made behind closed doors, and now the bill was coming due. The old system was being rejected, and nowhere did the anger burn hotter than in the Sahel. It began with a crisis France thought it would solve: jihadist insurgencies in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In 2013, French troops landed in Mali to launch Operation Serval, later expanded into Operation Barkhane, a sweeping anti-terror campaign across the region. Militants were pushed back, towns were retaken. France was seen, briefly, as a partner in defense. But years passed, and the terror didn't stop. In Mali and Burkina Faso, civilians kept dying. Armed groups spread. French troops, once hailed as protectors, began to feel like an occupying force. Foreign boots on African soil, delivering unclear results and making too many decisions behind closed doors. The resentment grew and merged with the deeper, older anger we've seen throughout this series. The economic chains, the political puppets, the humiliations of empire never fully erased. By the 2020s, something broke. In Bamako, protesters flooded the streets, waving Russian flags, a sign of defiance toward Paris. In Ouagadougou, a French cultural center was stormed. In Niamey, thousands rallied outside French military bases, some carrying coffins draped in the French tricolour. One protester put it plainly: "They plundered our resources, we became aware, so they're going to get out." And they did. In rapid succession, France's troops were expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Radio stations were shut down, ambassadors were told to leave. Decades-old defense pacts were burned. Even long-standing allies started pulling away. In Senegal, the government announced the closure of a major French base. In Côte d'Ivoire, a country once held up as the model of Françafrique, the president terminated its military agreement and ordered French troops out of Abidjan. Crowds danced as French convoys departed. "Au revoir, la France," they chanted, sometimes with cheers, sometimes with mock funerals, sometimes with flags set aflame. But the fury didn't stop at borders and troops. A growing chorus began demanding a cultural reckoning. The return of African artifacts from French museums, the rewriting of colonial history in African classrooms, and official recognition of massacres and repression long denied. From Sétif in 1945 to Madagascar in 1947 to France's shadowy role in Rwanda. In 2021, Macron made headlines by returning 26 looted treasures to Benin. It was hailed as historic, but for many, it wasn't nearly enough. As Benin's president said at the ceremony, "This is a piece of our soul, but we want the rest back too." Even that gesture, seen by Macron as reconciliation, couldn't outpace the growing narrative that France's presence in Africa had outlived its welcome. This was no longer about a single scandal, a single base, or a single company. It was about identity, dignity, and a generation that no longer saw France as protector, but as a permanent obstacle to true independence. What used to be dismissed as fringe or radical is now mainstream political reality. And as the fifth military government in the Sahel declared French influence dead, the rest of the continent watched, and many nodded in agreement. For decades, France called Africa its précaré, its backyard. Today, that backyard is locked, the fence is scorched, and new guests are already coming through the front door. The unraveling of Françafrique opened the door for new players, each bringing their own deals, their own ambitions, and their own flags, and African nations are choosing for themselves. Since taking office, Emmanuel Macron has tried to reposition France's image in Africa. He's admitted colonial crimes. He called the CFA franc system outdated. Macron's speeches in Ouagadougou and Dakar promised a new relationship. Less paternalism, more partnership. But the reality on the ground told a different story. Troops stayed and economic dominance continued. Rhetoric may have softened, but resentment hardened. As one Burkinabe youth activist put it, "We don't want apologies, we want you gone." As France's grip weakened, other powers didn't hesitate to move in, each offering their own version of partnership. Russia stepped in with military contracts, propaganda arms, and private security firms, especially the infamous Wagner Group. In Mali, after France was pushed out, Wagner filled the vacuum. Billboards popped up in Bamako showing Russian and Malian soldiers shaking hands under the slogan, "Victory is ours." Mali's military junta praised Moscow as a respectful ally, a sharp contrast to what they called France's arrogant paternalism. Wagner forces have also been spotted in Burkina Faso and the Central African Republic, where they protect regimes and mine gold, often accused of serious human rights abuses in the process. China took another route entirely: infrastructure and investment. Contracts, ports, and soft loans. From highways in Kenya to stadiums in Senegal, from telecoms in Zambia to railways in Nigeria, Beijing's footprint in Africa is massive. It's been called the silent superpower in the continent, omnipresent but rarely provocative. But the loans come with leverage. Some fear that if countries default, China could claim strategic assets like ports or power plants as collateral. Turkey has quietly become a key player too, especially in West Africa. It blends Islamic solidarity, commercial diplomacy, and cultural soft power. Turkish schools and hospitals have sprung up across the Sahel. Ankara-backed construction firms win public works contracts, and President Erdogan has positioned himself as a Muslim leader standing with African nations against Western dominance. But they're not the only ones. The Gulf states, especially the UAE and Qatar, have stepped up their presence through investment funds, humanitarian aid, and security deals. The UAE, for example, has deepened ties with Sudan, Chad, and the Sahel, blending business with influence. Qatar, meanwhile, has leveraged its media empire, Al Jazeera in particular, to gain soft power points across Francophone Africa, often giving voice to anti-French and pan-African perspectives. Everyone sees what France used to see. Africa is rich, strategic, and young. A continent of 1.4 billion people with resources the world needs and a population that will double by 2050. And while France spent decades acting like the gatekeeper, these new powers are walking right in, some with respect, others with checkbooks, and a few with guns. In every case, the appeal is simple. France had a century to prove itself. These powers are offering an alternative, even if it comes with new strings. At the core of this shift is a generational revolt. Older elites may still defend the old order, but young Africans are the majority now, and they're vocal, wired, and unafraid to speak. Online, anti-French memes, rap verses, and protest clips spread like wildfire. Offline, crowds chant "France dégage" and demand a future without foreign interference. To them, the issue isn't just France, it's the whole post-colonial scaffolding, and France just happens to be the face still standing. They don't want to swap one master for another. They want something entirely different. Sovereignty that's real. France still has leverage, but the myth of permanence is dead. Defense pacts are being torn up. Military bases are being emptied. Presidents once praised for their loyalty to Paris are now toppled, exiled, or under fire. France can adapt, or it can retreat, but what it can't do anymore is pretend things are fine. Because the message from the streets of Niamey, Bamako, Ouagadougou, and beyond is no longer diplomatic. It's loud, it's defiant, and it's clear. The era of French dominance in Africa is over, and this time, no amount of reform speeches can bring it back. So, why is France so hated in parts of Africa? It's not because of old wounds, it's because the wounds never healed. Because after the soldiers left, the contract stayed. After the flags came down, the money kept flowing in one direction. And after independence was declared, control was simply renamed. What remained was a system that, for decades, was designed to look like partnership, but was anything but. Africans are no longer asking for recognition, they're demanding it. On the streets, in classrooms, on ballots, and yes, sometimes in coups. Because whether through diplomacy, rebellion, or revolution, the message is the same. Enough. Enough exploitation, enough lectures, enough pretending that France was ever just a friend. But what do you think? Has France finally lost its grip on Africa? Or is this just the latest chapter in a long, complicated story? Do you see this as justice, overcorrection, or something in between? Are the new powers that are influencing African politics better or more of the same? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.